All right, we're picking up the book of Numbers at chapter 5, just going briefly through the book. We saw that the first 4 chapters have to do with the external organization, in a sense, of the camp of Israel, where we deal with more internal matters. In chapters 5 through 9, begins with, in chapter 5, the most important thing, or the most interesting thing in 5, besides the general teaching about cleansing of unclean conditions, is what we could call the ordeal of jealousy, which is a very interesting subject. There was a penalty, a very severe penalty, for committing adultery. Now, I won't defend this at this time. I'll simply make the observation that a man could have multiple wives, even concubines, and therefore sleeping with somebody other than his wife was not necessarily adultery, but if it was another man's wife, it was adultery. In other words, a woman who was married was not available to anyone except her husband. That wasn't necessarily true in the Old Testament with reference to husbands. They might be available to more than one woman as long as none of those women are married to somebody else. So adultery was really the violation of another man's marriage. Now I don't want to have time to talk about that, because actually that doesn't come up as a main feature, but it does come up that if a woman committed adultery, that is, she's married and she sleeps with somebody other than her husband, the penalty for her and her partner would be death. And yet, of course, adultery is the kind of sin that people don't do out in the public square very often. It's a secret thing. Most people, because a woman is married to somebody else, is doing it secretly. Her husband obviously would not approve, and especially if they're going to be put to death if they get caught. This can be done very secretly, and many times a husband doesn't find out that his wife has cheated on him. That's true of all times. It's true in biblical times too. But the passage in chapter 5 talks about the situation where a man suspects his wife has committed adultery. She might have or might not have. She might be innocent, or she might be guilty. The Bible actually talks about it as a spirit of jealousy comes upon him. And he's jealous. He just suspects that his wife's been unfaithful. Now, men sometimes suspect that about their wives, even when their wives are entirely faithful. Some men are just suspicious and, difficult that way for their wives, always accusing them of flirting or cheating or whatever. Other men have unfaithful wives who never have a hint of it and don't know that it's going on. But there was a way to test this suspicion, and that God would reveal whether the woman was innocent or guilty. And that was, if a spirit of jealousy came on a man and he thought his wife might have committed adultery, he could take her to the temple, and there was a ritual that could be performed there. It's a little bit elaborate, but for the most part it involved the priest taking dust off the floor of the tabernacle, mixing it with water, and basically the woman has to drink the water. Now, if she is guilty, it says her belly will swell and her thigh will rot. And I don't know if that's considered to be a lethal condition, that she dies of that, or if she then is just shown to be guilty and then she's stoned to death. I don't know. But if she's innocent, nothing will happen. Now, I had a skeptic, or a person who is not, to my mind, very intelligent, arguing about this. He was saying this is just like those ordeals of, that they suspected witches of back in the witch trials. You tie a rock around a woman's neck, throw her in the water. If she floats, she's innocent. And if she's guilty, she goes down. Well, obviously she's not going to float, so lo and behold, they always turn out to be guilty. The ordeal is supposed to show supernaturally whether she's really a witch or not, as suspected. This, in the Salem witch trials, it is alleged that this is the kind of way they found those things out. So he said, well, this is like that, If she's innocent, nothing happens. But something would happen normally, he's suggesting. Really? does something usually happen if you drink water that has dust in it? I've raised 5 little kids. They eat dirt all the time. I never had one whose belly swelled and whose thigh rotted as a result of eating dirt. And this guy was saying, well, that's some particular unusual sickness that must have been in the region or something that they pick up. No, this is treated as a supernatural thing. There's no known disease that I know of that can be contracted by eating dirt, which the result is your belly swells and your thigh rots. Even today, such a disease is not identified. So this is not a natural consequence. This is a supernatural consequence. But the interesting thing is, this is definitely tilted in favor of showing her innocent. Because this won't happen unless she's guilty. Now, this is therefore not a way of punishing guilty women. This is a way of vindicating innocent women. A woman who's guilty of that crime under the law was worthy of death anyway. And if she's guilty, then she just gets what she is, what her crime deserves. But if she's innocent, she might, without this ordeal, she might be forever suspected by her husband. She might have a husband who just never believes her. He's always accusing her. And what a torment that would be in her marriage. So she herself might very well recommend, hey, let's go to the temple and do this. If I'm guilty, God will show it. If I'm not, then you'll have to shut your mouth and stop accusing me, God himself will show I'm innocent. And so, and the default would be, people drinking water that has dust in it, by default, they would not have these symptoms arise. This would be something that most people could drink water that has dust in it, and it might not be very appetizing, but they'd go all along their life and nothing would happen. If there was some kind of contamination in the soil, then they might get some kind of a sickness, but it wouldn't be particularly this one that appears when the woman's really guilty. It's obvious that there's some kind of we're going to say, well, what does a swelling belly and the thyroid, what's that symbolize? I don't know what that symbolizes. It might have symbolic value, but whether it does or not, God might have just picked 2 symptoms that don't really go together in nature. That is something that cannot be thought to be the natural result of drinking this water. He picked 2 strange things, the thigh rotting and the belly swelling. Those are not in combination in any known sickness, so it would have to be, God showing that she is guilty this way. And it is, so the default would be nothing would happen. And God would have to do something special in this case to show she was guilty if she was. The innocent woman would be vindicated in this situation. That's the value. This is actually protection to a woman whose husband is suspicious of her and she's innocent. Well, this is God's way of showing that she's innocent. And the guy can no more make that accusation once this has been done. It's very interesting. Some people might think that this is related to Jesus' activities with the woman taken in adultery in John chapter 8, that he stooped down and he wrote something in the dust on the temple floor. He didn't put it in water or anything like that. It may not be related at all. But it's interesting that that was a case where a woman was on trial for adultery. She was actually caught in the act, so she wasn't on trial. It had been witnessed. But Jesus stooped down and did something with the dust on the temple floor, which has no parallels in the law except perhaps taking this dust from the tabernacle floor. But that Jesus didn't declare her innocent. He just said, whoever's not as guilty as she is, be the first to throw a stone at her, and then he wouldn't condemn her. But I don't know if there's any real intended connection between this ordeal of jealousy and what Jesus did there, but the dust on the floor is the one thing that connects those 2 stories. It may be totally coincidence. So then there's the Nazirite vow. Did you have a hand up, Rose?
I did have a thought. So, and this might be kind of a stretch, but I believe there were a couple instances when basically, I think it was Abraham and Isaac, but he asked him to grab his right
thigh, his thigh,
and that's kind of a symbol of taking your word or
it's the way a vow was made. A vow was made. Yeah, you're talking about when Abraham was sending his servant to go to find a bride for Isaac.
Yeah.
Abraham said, put your hand under my thigh and take this oath.
Yeah.
Now, why you'd put your hand under someone's thigh to take an oath, who knows? It's all Middle Eastern
Yeah.
stuff. But the interesting thing is that putting the hand under the thigh was associated, at least in Abraham's time, with taking an oath of some kind. Now,
Yeah.
of course, adultery is the violation of an oath.
Exactly.
Yeah, the violation of a vow. So that might be why the thigh would rot. It would symbolize that the vow had been broken. The belly swelling,
Yeah.
hard to say what that would be, but that's an interesting observation you make. Yeah, Nadia?
Aren't thighs also like representations of fertility of women?
Well, that's
The room like of pregnancy?
that comes to mind also, is that the belly swelling is what happens to a woman when she's pregnant and has a baby, but in this case she doesn't have a baby, and probably she's not going to get a chance to either, because she's guilty of adultery. She'll be stoned to death. So I don't know what that means. Maybe it means her womb will be vacant. You know, it's like the swelling looks like there's a baby there, but there's no baby coming. You know, I don't know. It's really hard to be sure, and I would not forbid any kinds of conjectures about that. But all I can say is we have no biblical way of knowing, you know, what those mean. But it could be that somebody's guess would be correct. I just wouldn't be able to confirm it or disconfirm it. Now in chapter 6, we come to the Nazirite vow. Now the word Nazirite means separated, and a person would take this vow voluntarily, usually. We know of 3 people whose parents made the Nazirite vow for them before they were born, and they were then Nazirites for their entire life. One was Samson, and one was Samuel, and one was John the Baptist. All of these 3 men were declared to be Nazirites before they were born, even before they were conceived, actually. So that was an unusual situation. Most people are not Nazirites for life, but a few were. In Israel, anyone could take a Nazirite vow for a period of time. As I understand, a month was the shortest time they could take, though it doesn't say so in Numbers. I suppose that was in the Talmud. But anytime from a month to forever, you could take a Nazirite vow. And during the Nazirite vow, there were 3 things you would not do. You would not cut your hair or beard. You would not touch any product of the grapevine. Wine, grape juice, raisins, grapes, nothing from the grapevine would be consumed by the Nazirite. And you would not go to a funeral or touch a dead body or come near a dead body. Now, of those 3, coming near a dead body is simply it's just one of the many laws of uncleanness. Israelites were not supposed to come near a dead body or they'd be defiled for a week. But it wasn't like it was a sin. Again, ritual defilement is not the same thing as a sin. I've told you before that the rituals are symbolic of spiritual truths. But the fact that he was not allowed, so I mean, a regular Israelite might, and probably should, go to his own parents' funeral, but that would make them unclean for a week. Later on, by the way, in Numbers, we will find that there's a keeping of the Passover, and some people were unable to do it on that day because they had become unclean by being associated with some dead body. So they had to postpone their observance of the Passover till they were clean again. But the becoming unclean by occasion of a dead body would be everyone would at one point or another. If they have a loved one who dies, they have to prepare the body to bury and so forth. So uncleanness is not a sin, but it is something that it represented sin in the symbolic sense that rituals represent spiritual things. Now, the fact that the Nazirite could not come near a dead body, therefore, might be suggestive of the idea that it's, a person has to remain spiritually undefiled. I mean, under the law, it would be just ritually undefiled, but if there's a spiritual counterpart to this Nazirite vow and its provisions, then it might be that it speaks of remaining spiritually pure and undefiled. As far as not eating anything from the grapevine, we have to understand that wine in particular, and grapes and grape juice, were extremely common at all meals. Wine especially was a necessary thing at a meal because water was not safe to drink unless you added wine to it. Just like in third world countries today, would be wise not to drink the water unless you can disinfect it. And you might put iodine tablets in it, or you might filter it, or you can mix it with wine. If you put a bit of wine in the water, it kills the microbes. And everyone knew that in ancient times. The Romans, the Greeks, the Jews, everyone added water to their wine to make it safe. That's why Paul told Timothy, stop drinking only water and put a little wine in it like everybody else does for your stomach's sake and your oft infirmities. Timothy apparently was trying to be a Nazarite and not take any wine, and he's being too spiritual and he was getting sick from the amoebas. So Paul said, put some wine in that water. And that was normal. You know, sometimes people say, did Jesus make real wine with alcohol in it? You know, I mean, wouldn't he then be responsible for getting people drunk at the wedding feast? Well, he did make real wine with alcohol in it, sure. He wasn't responsible for making people drunk any more than God's responsible for making people gluttons because he made food.
I like that.
There's, you know, that God makes something and someone abuses it, that's not God's fault. Getting drunk is abusing wine, but there was a right use of wine, and it had to be alcohol or it could be no good. You couldn't make your water safe to drink unless you had alcoholic wine. Now, that means that at every table, there was wine. And in fact, even drinking water required that you have wine in it. Unless you were a Nazarite, then I guess you had to take your chances. But the norm was to mix 1 part wine with like 3 or 4 parts water. And you'd call it wine, but it's really drinking water that's been purified. So the Nazarite, if he's not drinking wine, he's kind of avoiding table fellowship and meals and stuff, because that's always going to have wine there, and grapes and raisins very commonly too. The idea may be that he's separating himself to God. He's also thereby separating himself somewhat from society and from social life for the period of his vow. At least the abstinence of things from the vine might symbolize the abstinence from table fellowship and social life and so forth with others. You're separated unto God, even from other people. Now, what about the hair? What's the value of growing the hair? Well, there may be some symbolism in it, or it might just be that the hair was a marker of time. So like the odometer of your car measures the progress of the miles you've covered, the length of your hair kind of measures out how long you've been doing this, you know? Your hair gets longer by nature. And if you take a vow for a month, your hair grows out a little bit, but if you do it for a year, it grows out more. If you do it for a lifetime, you're going to have hair and beard, if you're a man, down to your belly button. And by the way, a woman could take the Nazarite vow too. According to Josephus, Agrippa II, his wife took a Nazarite vow. And it involves shaving the head, by the way. The Nazarite, it doesn't specifically say they shave their head at the beginning, but they do shave their head at the end and burn the hair as an offering to God. It's called the hair of their separation. In other words, the long hair represents the length of time they've been doing it. Now that would work best if they shaved at the beginning too, because if they already had hair before they started the vow, and all that hair they cut off would not be the hair of their separation. So presumably they shaved their head at the beginning of the vow, and then they grew their hair out during the time of the vow, and then they cut it off. Now, therefore, when you see pictures of Samson or Samuel or John the Baptist in picture books or movies, and they only have a beard this long and hair to their shoulders, it's not authentic. These men were like 30 years old and never cut their hair or beard in their life, so they're going to be pretty shaggy looking guys. But that's what a Nazarite did. Now, of course, if you took the Nazarite vow only for a few months, your appearance might not drastically be changed. But it may also be that the longer hair and beard, that its purpose was to be a demonstration that you're on a Nazarite vow. People might not know looking at you walking down the street whether you're a Nazarite unless there was something to distinguish you. Now, I don't know if that was necessary or for that reason or not. But of course it would be so that you could tell a Nazarite, if he'd been on the vow for very long, you could tell a Nazarite at a glance because he had longer hair than he normally would. And it may well be that this symbolizes the fact that a person who's holy is noticeably holy. People around him will notice that he's holy, just like a person who notices a Nazarite has long hair, the hair of his separation. The hair represents the time of his separation to God, his holiness. And therefore, you know, these three things: abstain from grape products, do not touch dead bodies, do not cut your hair or beard. Those things all could represent spiritual parallels. What's interesting is that Paul took a Nazarite vow as a Christian in Acts chapter 18 and verse 18. And it's according to Numbers chapter 6. This is where the Nazarite vow is described. Why did he do so? Well, we don't know. He did so as he was leaving Corinth and going to Jerusalem. All we are told in Acts 18:18 is that Paul shaved his head as he was leaving Corinth because he had a vow. Now, if this is shaving his head at the end of a vow, then he had been growing it while he was in Corinth, because he's leaving Corinth at this point, shaves his head. It'd be like at the end of a vow. He'd been growing his hair in Corinth, which is a little interesting, since he had said to the Corinthians later in 1 Corinthians 11:14, it's a shame for a man to have long hair. If Paul was growing his hair long when he was in their midst, that would be a strange object. He said, does not nature itself teach you that for a man to have long hair, it's a shame to him? It says in 1 Corinthians 11:14. Or maybe he shaved his head at the beginning of a vow because he's going to Jerusalem, and being a Nazarite in Jerusalem is a respectable thing. By the way, the fact that Paul did say to the Corinthians it's a shame for a man to have long hair is something that has perhaps confused some people, because it's not. It's not a shame for a Nazarite, for example, to have long hair. It was a matter of showing you're separated to God. It's actually a mark of piety, not a shame before God. It's a cultural issue that Paul's talking about. In the Corinthian Greek culture, men did not wear their hair long. Women did. So for a man to wear his hair long would be like to imitate a woman. You know, in Deuteronomy, it says it's an abomination for a man to wear what pertains to a woman, and for a woman to wear what pertains to a man. So in any society, different styles of hair and clothing are considered male styles, and other styles are considered female styles. In Greece, where the Corinthians were, it was a woman's style not to cut her hair, and a men's style was to cut his hair short. So if a man in Corinth grew his hair long, as a Greek man, he'd be more or less imitating a woman's styles, and gratuitously. And for a man to look like a woman is a shame. Nature itself teaches you that, Paul said. But in Jerusalem, it would not be a shame. In other words, this shamefulness that Paul speaks of is not universal, it's local and custom. In the same chapter, Paul said a man shouldn't pray with his head covered. But that's not universal. God told the priests to wear turbans on their heads when they go into the temple, into the tabernacle. That was commanded. Jewish men for many centuries have worn the yarmulke on their head. Having their head covered, it's not a shame among the Jews, and should not be, because God commanded the priests to wear coverings on their heads when they worship. So obviously when Paul says that men should not have their head covered, they should not wear their hair long, it's a shame. He's talking to the Corinthians about practices in their church, in that culture. It would not be applicable everywhere, and Paul himself says so, because after he's given that whole discussion about covering the head and hair length and all that stuff, he says, if anyone seems to be contentious, we don't have any such customs. That is, we who are not Greeks, we Christians like me, Paul, a Jew, I don't have that custom. I'm advising you about customs that pertain to you in your culture. I'm going to grow my hair out. I've got a Nazarite vow, We don't have these customs. It's not universal, so don't fight over it. He said if someone wants to be contentious about it, it's not worth fighting about. It's not universal, is what Paul says in verse 16. Now, that's the Nazarite thing in Numbers chapter 6. Now, chapter 7 is one of those chapters that's a little bit tedious. each of the tribes had to select a representative to bring gifts to the tabernacle on behalf of their tribe. Each tribe had to provide some things, and their representative would bring them and present them in 12 successive days. Each day, one guy would bring them from one tribe. Now, they all brought the same thing, and this is what makes the chapter tedious, because each tribe gets 6 verses, and the 6 verses are the same for each one. Each one was to bring, in his turn, on his day, the following: 1 silver platter, 130 shekels weight, and 1 silver bowl, 70 shekels weight. Both of these were to be filled with fine flour and oil, and they were going to be offered as a grain offering. Okay, that is, the contents were. The silver platter and the silver bowl would be used for regular stuff in the tabernacle after that. I mean, they had to prepare food and do all kinds of things in the tabernacle, so they needed dishes and stuff like that. So 1 silver platter and 1 silver bowl were brought, each filled with fine flour and oil. Then there was also 1 gold pan of 10 shekels weight. Now this is gold. And that would be full of incense, which would be, of course, probably burned in this tabernacle. Then there were burnt offerings: 1 bull, 1 male goat, and 1 yearling male lamb. These 3 were brought for a burnt offering in each case. And then also 1 kid of the goats for a sin offering. And finally, there would be peace offerings offered, and they'd be 2 oxen, 5 rams, 5 male goats, and 5-year-old lambs. Now that's a lot of detail, and it goes over that detail 12 times in this chapter with all the same information. So the things that was that?
That's my favorite chapter.
Favorite chapter? Yeah, I'm sure it is. It's inspiring, isn't it? Gives me the goosebumps when I read it. So all those things, each tribe had to provide all those things in their own successive days. And so we go through the chapter. The first day, the guy from Judah in verse 12 brings all this stuff. His name's Aminadab. The second day in verse 18, the guy from Issachar brings all the same stuff. His name's Nathanael. Then we have Zebulun. The guy's name is Eliab. You've got Reuben, tribe of Reuben. His name is Eliezer. The tribe of Simeon has a guy named Shelumiel. The tribe of Gad has a guy named Eliasaph. The tribe of Ephraim, a guy named Elishama. Manasseh's tribe has a guy named Gamaliel or Gamaliel. There you go. And the tribe of Benjamin, a guy named Abidan. The tribe of Dan, a guy named Ahiezer. I hope you keep memorizing these. Tribe of Asher, a guy named Pagiel. And the tribe of Naphtali had a guy named Ahira. Now these, we have their names, we have their tribes, we have the order in which they came each one day, right, and all the stuff they brought. That's what makes up chapter 7. One of the more difficult chapters to read, along with chapter 1 and a few others. Then in chapter 8, because God has adopted the Levites, of course, in the place of the firstborn, and they are going to be serving in the tabernacle, they have to go through a special consecration rite, and that is in chapter 8. Now, the consecration rite involves the following. If you were a Levite, there was a special day that they were all going to be consecrated to be serving in the tabernacle from there on. This only had to happen one time. After that, each generation was already considered to be under this consecration of Levites. But first, they would be sprinkled with holy water. We'll say more about that holy water later on and the red heifer involved in it. But they'd be sprinkled with holy water, and then they were to shave their body hair and their head hair completely. They're supposed to be without hair, and they were to wash their clothes. So this suggests a complete separation from all defilement of their past. They're starting a new life, like a bald baby, and their clothes that they've worn before are to be washed before they're put back on. You might say, of course, who's going to put on dirty clothes? Hey, when you live in the desert, you don't wash your clothes very often, or your body. There wasn't that much water there. You know, we are pretty spoiled. We got indoor plumbing. I don't like a day to go by without taking a shower, at least, and washing my hair. I don't like it. But in times past, people went months without bathing and without washing their clothes. A lot of people did not own a second pair of clothes. I mean, this is, in the biblical times, wealth was sometimes measured in how many changes of clothes you had. And the average poor person might not have a change of clothes. The clothes he wore until they were ragged, and he probably bathed in them so that they'd get clean once in a while. But yeah, these guys had to bathe, or they had to wash their clothes, they had to shave their hair. Then they had to present themselves at the tabernacle. At that point, the nation of Israel lays hands on them. Now, obviously, not every one of the people in Israel could lay hands on these guys, but apparently maybe the tribal leaders or representatives. The point is, the Israelites are transferring to these guys the right to be their representatives, serving God as their agents, as the priest and Levites do. So Israel lays hands on them, and then the Levites lay hands on two different bulls. One of these bulls is a sin offering, and one of them is a burnt offering. Then there's this very strange statement that Aaron offers them like a wave offering. Now, it doesn't say that in the New Living Translation. It says he offers them like as a special offering. The New Living Translation just says as a special offering. It actually says as a wave offering. Now, how do you offer the Levites as a wave offering? We were talking about wave offerings before, that we don't know exactly what they look like or what they involve, but it seems like when they take the shoulder of the animal and they wave it before the Lord, probably they literally lifted up in their hands and waved it before the Lord. How do you do it without all the Levites? How do you do that? You know, can't lift them up and do that. So maybe it's just kind of a motion of waving or something like that. Okay, this action covers all you guys here, you know. You guys are all included in this consecration. We're not told. Again, I've told you before that some of these rituals we only have to guess how they looked when they were performed. But that's what chapter 8 is about. And then chapter 9, the first 14 verses, they keep the second Passover. This is 1 year after they left Egypt. They left Egypt on the Passover. This is now a year later, so they're going to keep a second Passover. Now, there's nothing too unusual about that. This is something to be done every year. But the interesting thing in this particular story is that some people came to Moses and said, well, we got a bit of a problem here. Passover's coming up, and we've got some men here who are defiled because they've been in contact with a dead body. Chances are they buried someone relative of theirs or whatever, and so they were defiled for 7 days. Well, Passover is coming. You can't keep the Passover where you're in a state of uncleanness. So they asked if a provision could be made for them to do it at another time. Moses went before the Lord. The Lord said, that's fair enough. Those who are defiled on the 14th day of the first month, which is Passover, they can celebrate the Passover on the 14th day of the second month. Now, what's interesting about this, I suppose, what's significant, is that God's flexible about that and reasonable. Sometimes we think God doesn't seem very reasonable. You know, Uzzah touches the Ark of the Covenant, God strikes him dead on the spot. Nadab and Abihu offer strange fire, and fire from God comes out and consumes them. You know, a guy curses God, another guy gathers sticks on the Sabbath, they both get put to death. Some people say, well, God's pretty strict. He's kind of legalistic. He's not really very flexible, is he? Well, this shows that he kind of is. I mean, the law says you got to do this on the 14th day of the first month. God says, well, I mean, let's be reasonable. These guys can't do it in a defiled state, and it's not through their own fault that they may have had a relative die. an inopportune time, so we'll make an adjustment for that. Now, see, the difference between this and these other cases where God doesn't seem to have any flexibility is when God is inflexible, it's when people are doing things that they don't in any sense have to do. Some people say, well, there's all these capital crimes in the law of Moses. It seems so unfair. If a child curses his father, he's put to death. If he strikes his father or mother, he's put to death. If a person's a witch, they're put to death. If they commit adultery, they're put to death. If they're homosexual, they're put to death. If they kidnap somebody, they're put to death. If they worship idols, they're put to death. I mean, sheesh, there must have been a thinning of the ranks every other day. You know, how did anyone ever survive? But you have to realize that all those things that for which a person was put to death are things that no one has to do. They're not mandatory to do them. There's nothing in the needs of your body or the needs of your life that makes you have to commit adultery or makes you have to practice witchcraft or worship idols or kidnap somebody's kid. In other words, these laws probably prevented those things from happening. If the laws had been more lenient, then people might have been more willing to take their chances and do these things. But when you know, hey, this is death penalty stuff, I think I'll pass. You know, thinking about committing adultery, I think maybe I won't, because it's got the death penalty. The death penalty had a tremendous deterrent effect, I'm sure. And therefore, no child in Israel ever had to be put to death for striking his father or mother. Unless he did it, then he would. But we never read of him ever doing it. We never read of the death penalty ever being brought against any of these crimes in the Old Testament except for idolatry. And there probably were cases of adultery that got caught. We don't have record of them necessarily, but I mean, there probably were people who violated these things, but it doesn't seem like they did very often. We don't have record of these penalties being carried out in the Old Testament. So the penalties were not so unfair. They more made a civil society. You know, they say in Montana, an armed society is a polite society. You go into a bank in Montana, there's people with gun, you know, people doing business who've got a gun on their hip. Think, whoa, you know, like the Old West. You know, if people have guns, it's going to be people dying everywhere. No, if everyone has a gun, there's going to be a lot fewer people dying. And I'm not here as a gun advocate. I'm just saying the facts are. Cities and states in the country that allow people to carry concealed guns or non-concealed guns have lower crime. Because an armed society is a polite society. The fact that there's someone in the McDonald's with you who's packing may keep you from going in there and shooting the place up, because you might not get many rounds off before a few of them hit you from customers. And you know, we don't think this way very often, but that is simply the way things work, and that's how it is with Israel and the death penalty. A society with a death penalty is going to be a little more civilized, going to have fewer capital crimes committed than a society that doesn't have a death penalty. And so God had the death penalty for a lot of these kinds of things. Now, how do we get off on that? Let me think. Oh yeah, I'm talking about how God was flexible about letting people change the law when it was reasonable. When they had through no fault of their own, they'd become unclean. They couldn't keep Passover on the day. So he said, okay, we can move it for you. God's not unreasonable. But everything that people were struck dead for in the Bible are things they didn't have to do, and they knew better. Now you might say, that's still too severe. Well, they should have known better. They could have lived out a natural lifetime if they had done what they knew they're supposed to do. Now I've heard people say, I think it was even Gandhi who said, if we follow an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, then all of society is going to be, blind and toothless. Well, not really. If there's a penalty, you strike my eye out, you get your eye struck out. You strike my tooth out, you get yours out. You're probably not going to strike my eye out because you don't lose your eye. We're not going to have if the society has followed an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, like God said in the Old Testament, there's not going to be very many people taking the risk of knocking somebody else's tooth out because they don't want to lose one of theirs. You're not going to have a blind and toothless society. You're going to have a society where very few teeth are knocked out of people and very few eyes are poked out. That's just the nature of criminal law enforcement. And while we may think, well, I think those penalties sometimes are a little stiffer than they need to be. Well, if you live in a society that has stiffer penalties than they should be, don't do the crime, and you won't have to do the time.
Well, come on.
It's that easy. And when people say, the Christian position toward, say, homosexual behavior, just to take an example that's talked about a lot now, it's unfair to homosexuals. It's cruel to them. It punishes them. I don't think so. I'm not punishing anybody. If you don't have to have sex, by the way. I hope you know that because you're single. I've been single many years of my life too, even after my first marriage. I've spent 16 years single after I had been married. And for all I knew, I was going to be single the rest of my life. It turns out I'm not. I found a wife, but as far as I knew, I might never find another wife, so I might be single the rest of my life. I had to be celibate. I'm not gay, but I still had to be celibate. Is that punishing me? No, it's only punishing if we live in a society where people think, if you have sex drives, you better have sex. How can you be expected to control yourself? How can you be expected not to have sex when you want to have sex? Well, there is such a thing as self-restraint. There is such a thing as moral behavior. To say, well, if you've got attraction to the same sex, sorry, you're going to be celibate. Well, the same is true if you have attraction to the opposite sex and you're not married to them. So, the law of Moses assumed, and rightly so, that people don't have to do the things that are forbidden. They may be strongly tempted to, and in that case it's good to have strong inducements not to do it. Like the death penalty, that's a pretty strong inducement. Adultery and homosexual behavior among those who have that orientation, and many other crimes that were death penalty crimes in the Bible, they are things that people are strongly tempted to violate. They don't have to violate them, and that's proven by the fact that many people don't. I was a virgin when I got married. The first time. Not the second time. Most of the people my age at that time were not virgins because they were hippies. And one of the values of hippiedom is free sex. I was a Christian. I was not a hippie, I was a Christian. I became a hippie after I became a Christian. But not that kind of hippie. The point is, teenagers are strongly attracted to have sex. I can testify, you don't have to do it. Older people are strongly tempted to have sex. I can testify, you don't have to do it. Whether it's gay or heterosexual, it doesn't matter. You don't have to do it. And that's what the severe penalties of the law underscored. They didn't have to. Now the law was adjustable for cases where you had no power. It was God himself who declared these men to be unclean for touching a dead body, which was something they couldn't not do, and who also said that unclean people couldn't participate in the Passover. So, that was because they were basically following God's instructions here. So he can change things. He's reasonable. And so he changed it so they could have Passover a month later instead of when it was normally had. Okay? And that brings us essentially almost to the end of chapter 9. From chapter 9, verse 15 through chapter 10, verse 10, we have a couple other issues. One is the cloud begins to move, so they've got to move. But there's also the forming of 2 silver trumpets. These were to signal to the nation. It's a good way before they had electronic communication stuff. everybody can hear a trumpet if you're encamped near each other. That's why bugles have been used historically for, the cavalry and stuff. They sound the bugle to give signals to each other. That's what the trumpets were for. Now, the trumpets were used for a couple things. One, initially they were used to alert the camp to gather before the Lord. If God wanted to gather the whole camp before the tabernacle, they could sound the trumpets. If the cloud was moving and it was time to pack up and go, the trumpets would sound. Also, the trumpets are said to have been useful for calling people to battle. Now, there was no battle initially, but eventually they'd fight wars, and so the trumpets were useful for that too. And the sounding of one trumpet would be different than the sounding of two in terms of what it's communicating. All of that is discussed there. So the making of these two silver trumpets is what we have there in the remainder of the time that they were encamped. They begin to move in chapter 10, and so we come to another, verse 11, we come to another part of the story. So they were, in the chapters we've covered, they were at Mount Sinai preparing to do the last preparation and so forth to move along. Now they begin to move along. So in chapter 10, verse 11, through chapter 14, verse 45, these 5 chapters essentially are the journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. Now, Kadesh Barnea was an 11-day walk from Mount Sinai. Kadesh Barnea was at the edge near the Promised Land, near enough that they could send spies from there to go into Canaan, search out the land, and bring back a report to Kadesh Barnea, where Israel was camped. So it was possible to move from Sinai to the edge of the Promised Land in 11 days. As it turned out, they took 40 years wandering in the wilderness. But they could have been there in 2 weeks instead of 40 years if they had not had so little faith. Now, the journey to Kadesh Barnea from Sinai is recorded in these chapters, chapters 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. The latter part of chapter 10, verses 11 through 36, is simply talking about them breaking camp and moving and leaving Mount Sinai. Then we have some other things happen. In chapter 11, the people begin to complain about eating manna all the time. Now, God started giving them manna back in Exodus chapter 16, just almost immediately after they came out of Egypt. They needed food. They couldn't farm, and there wasn't much hunter-gathering type stuff you could do out there in that wilderness, not much food to gather. And so God began to provide manna, which was supernaturally provided. It's called bread from heaven. It was an interesting stuff. Apparently, it was capable of being mashed into something that resembled flour, and then they could make cakes or pancakes and other things from the manna. It is said by someone who obviously had tasted it in the record that it was like bread that was made with, or cakes that were made with oil. And they ate this every day. Now, did they eat anything else? Well, we don't know. Manna was apparently the staple upon which they lived for those 40 years. It apparently was nutritious enough that it could sustain them. That doesn't mean they never ate a bite of anything else. They might have caught a rabbit once. No, they couldn't eat rabbits. They might have caught something. No. Yeah, they couldn't eat rabbits. That was unclean. But they might have caught something they could eat. Locusts. Locusts were clean. I'm sure they had a chance to find some of those once in a while. Yeah. They also had a lot of livestock with them, which they didn't want to slaughter because obviously that was their breeding stock for the future. And they needed livestock to offer as sacrifices on a regular basis. They had their flocks and their herds were not simply available to slaughter them and eat them. Some of them had to be sacrificed on a regular basis. Others needed to be kept for breeding stock, so they didn't enter the Canaan without any animals. And so they did not see their flocks and their herds as something to be killed off and eaten. That doesn't mean they never killed a single cow or a single lamb and ate it. They may have from time to time, but they lived mainly on manna. And because they lived mainly on manna, it was dull. It was not sweet, apparently not very sweet. I guess a little bit, because it was like, I think cakes made with honey also, as I recall. But it was not exactly something you'd want to eat every day if you're an Epicurean. And so they began to complain about the blandness of the food. And then Moses began to complain to God and saying, why do I have to put up with these complaining people? These people are not my kids. Did I beget these kids that I have to carry them around like they're my own babies? This is too much for me. That's too heavy a load for me. And so God said, I'll tell you, I'll take care of both problems. I'm going to send meat, enough for these people to eat. They're going to eat so much of it, it's going to come out their noses, he said, which means they're going to vomit it out. They're going to get sick eating it. But he also said, and I'm going to give you some help. You don't like leaving these people yourself? Bring 70 of the elders of Israel to the tabernacle, and I'll take some of the spirit that's on you. I'll put my spirit on them too. And they will share the burden of leadership, of spiritual leadership. So, Moses, this is all in chapter 11, Moses brought the 70 selected men to the tabernacle. We're told that he did, but there were 2 of them that weren't in the group. A guy named Eldad and a guy named Medad. 2 guys. Sound like brothers to me, but it doesn't say they were. Eldad and Medad. They were 2 of the 70, but they didn't come to the tabernacle, but that wasn't noticed initially. 68 of the 70 came to the tabernacle, and the Spirit came upon them, and they all began to prophesy, though that only happened once. That is, they didn't become prophets from then on. It's just that they prophesied initially, which showed that they had the Spirit upon them, the same Spirit that came on Moses, who was a prophet. Now, someone came and reported, Moses, Eldad, and Medad are not here. They're prophesying inside in the camp. And Joshua was concerned, said, Moses, forbid them. Now, why would that be something to forbid? Well, no doubt it's this. Moses was always being challenged as far as his unique leadership. If other men were obviously able to prophesy from God, maybe people would say, hey, I'm going to follow him. I like him better than Moses. I don't like this Moses anyway. This guy may be a better leader. And therefore, the 70 were supposed to be all there in one place where Moses could supervise them. That they're not out in the camp, making a name for themselves as prophets, which would possibly result in Moses' unique authority as the leader being undermined. So Joshua, when he heard hey, there's 2 guys who aren't here, they're out there prophesying. Moses, tell them not to do it. Well, Moses didn't worry about that. He said, are you jealous for me? He said, would to God that all the Lord's people were prophets and that he'd put his Spirit upon them. So we could say Moses was a very commendable, non-jealous kind of a man, or it might be just he's sick of being the leader. So I wish God could put his Spirit on them, they wouldn't need me, Who needs them? I don't need them. Why do they need me? But the interesting thing is that Moses did express the desire that God would put his Spirit on all of his people. Would to God that all the Lord's people were prophets and that he'd put his Spirit upon them. This is exactly what a later prophet, Joel, said would happen. In Joel chapter 2, God said, I'm going to pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and daughters will prophesy. So all the Lord's people would in fact be prophets, and he'd put his Spirit on them. And that happened, of course, on the day of Pentecost. When the Spirit came upon the 120 believers in the upper room, Peter said, this is that which was prophesied by the prophet Joel. And he quotes Joel chapter 2 on this very thing. So Moses expresses a wish that actually is God's wish too. God intended someday to give his Spirit to everybody. And this raises an issue that you need to know as you go through the Old Testament. Did people who were godly in the Old Testament have the Holy Spirit or not? The answer is usually not. It says in John chapter 7 and verse 39, Jesus was speaking, and he had said that he'd give living water to anyone who believes in him. And John, in John 7:39, interprets Jesus' prediction or his promise about living water, and he says, this he spoke concerning the Holy Spirit, which was not yet given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. Now, that means that God had not given his Holy Spirit generally to God's people until Jesus was raised from the dead, until he was glorified. Well, then what about the Old Testament? The Spirit came upon Moses, the Spirit came upon David, the Spirit came even upon Saul and on the prophets. Well, what didn't happen until Jesus was glorified was that God put his Spirit on all his people, on his, on all flesh. This thing that Moses wished might happen is that God put his Spirit on all his people and they'd all prophesy. That didn't happen until Pentecost, after Jesus was glorified. But what did happen in the Old Testament is that God would put his Spirit on some people occasionally for special purposes. In the book of Judges, you'll find that in not every case, but most cases, it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Ehud, or the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, or the Spirit of the Lord came on Samson. These are judges, and God would then, by putting his Spirit on them, raise them up to be the leaders to deliver Israel in battle from their oppressors. We find that the Spirit of the Lord comes on the kings of Israel. When Saul was anointed king, the Spirit came upon him. When David was then later anointed king, the Spirit left Saul and came on David. You see, we see the Spirit of God performing special things through special people. The prophets. We often read of the Spirit coming upon the prophets. And that's why they were able to prophesy. The Holy Spirit spoke through them. But this is special people. This is not the whole nation. The whole nation of Israel were God's people, but they didn't have the Spirit upon them. They just lived under law. They were supposed to do what the law said and do it the best they could, but they didn't have God's Spirit within them to enable them as we do. The new covenant was to be that God would write his law on our inward parts, in our hearts. That's different than the old covenant. Ezekiel 36 was talking about the new covenant, and he said that God's going to take out the heart of stone and put in a heart of flesh and put his Spirit within you. So for God to internalize his law, to write it on our hearts by the Holy Spirit so that we are transformed inwardly by the possession of the Holy Spirit, that's a new covenant thing. The old covenant just didn't have that. But that didn't mean that the Holy Spirit never came on people. Special cases, the Holy Spirit did come upon certain people. And so on this occasion, the Spirit came on the 70, including Eldad and Medad, and they prophesied, but just the once. We don't know what they did after that, what their role was. But there's a good chance that they became sort of a council that Moses consulted with. We don't read of it happening, but they were there for a purpose. They were chosen to help bear the load of leadership. So, exactly how they did that after this is not explained. It's more important that the Spirit came upon them, and that's what qualified them to bear any kind of role of leadership. How they exercised it with Moses, we do not ever read. But in the same chapter, of course, God fulfills his promise about the meat too. He sends quail. Now the quail came in such abundance that they were either flying around at about 3 feet off the ground, or they were falling dead and stacked on the ground 3 feet deep. It's not entirely clear. There were a lot of quail. They were easy to catch and easy to eat, so the people grabbed a bunch of them, gobbled them down, and then they got sick and vomited them up. In fact, it says specifically, while the meat was still between their teeth, God smote them with a plague, and so they got real ill. And so that was sort of God's way of, telling them, don't complain about the food. And for YWAMers, there's a lesson there. All right? Okay. Then, chapter 12, we have another interesting story, and this time, two people who had, in fact, prophesied before, Moses' own brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, began to complain against Moses. Now, the occasion of this is said to be because Moses married an Ethiopian woman. This tells us a number of things. First of all, his first marriage was not his only marriage. He had married Zipporah, who was a Midianite woman. She apparently wasn't with him anymore. And we talked about that when we were in Exodus. We find that when she circumcised her son, there was a contention between her and Moses. She apparently left. He either sent her away. The Bible does suggest he sent her away. And so she later came to visit him along with her dad. I think it was the 18th chapter of Exodus. But we don't read that she, nor certainly her dad, stayed. Her dad, in fact, didn't stay, and we don't know if she did or not. But now we have Moses married to another woman of another ethnicity, Ethiopian. Now, by the way, Ethiopians are very black people. The Jews were probably brown people. You know, we don't know exactly. I mean, we think of Jews sometimes say as white because so many of them are European Jews and American Jews. But if you go to North Africa, the Jews there are black. You go to China, the Jews there are Chinese looking. I mean, the Jews intermarried with the locals. So before all that intermarriage took place, we don't know exactly what color they were, but the Bible does not indicate that they were black. There are today a cult called Black Israelites who say that the black people are the true Israelites. But there are many things in the Bible that suggest that that is not the case. Nonetheless, Moses married a black woman, which means he married interracially. Now, this did not please his brother or his sister. And they said, you know, this Moses, he's not perfect. He's certainly not the only guy who can lead these people. Has God only spoken by him? No, he's spoken by us too. Aaron and Miriam, each in their turn, had had their time to speak for God. And so they said, they began to imply that they're losing confidence in Moses' judgment. Here he married this Ethiopian woman. And, you know, maybe God speaks for him, but he speaks by us too, so what's so special about him? Well, this murmuring by Aaron and Miriam might have begun to affect the morale of people to whom they spoke. We don't know. But in any case, God was not pleased with it, and he struck Miriam with leprosy. Actually, first he called them. He called Aaron and Miriam, you step forward here, apparently at the tabernacle. And they probably knew they were in trouble. They stepped up, and then God struck Miriam with leprosy. And he said to them, listen, if I raise up a prophet in Israel, I will speak to them through dreams or visions. But my servant Moses is in a class by himself. With him I do not speak with mysterious sayings. I speak face to face with him. He said, why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And that's when Miriam was struck with leprosy. Now when Moses saw that, of course, he was chagrined that his sister was leprous. And so he prayed for her, and God said, okay, I'm going to take the leprosy away, but she's going to be unclean for, I think it was 3 days or something like that. And so they couldn't travel until she was clean again. So she got humbled, and Aaron too. Now, why didn't God strike Aaron also? Yeah, probably because the tabernacle function couldn't get along without him for 3 days. Yeah, he was a pretty important character. After all, it was just him and two priests taking care of all the needs of the whole community, so he probably was not expendable. Miriam, on the other hand, didn't play any regular function in the tabernacle, and she could become an example, and God made an example of her. Now, chapters 13 and 14 I'm going to go over very quickly here. It's very important, but we've mentioned it before. Chapter 13, there's 12 spies selected, one from each tribe, to go and spy out the land of Canaan. The reason for this is not exactly, clear. I mean, it would appear that it's, you would, if you're going to invade a country, want to do some surveillance and find out what you can about that. But it may have been that Moses approved of it because he thought it'd do good to the Israelites to hear how lush the land was and give them some incentive to go forward and take it. The people who wanted to go and send spies may have done so just because they wanted to find out if it's safe. In any case, Moses approved and the people approved, and so these spies went for 4 days, and they came back with a report. Sure enough, it was a great land, and it was also not safe. So, they brought back a report such as Moses wanted in one sense, because they said, man, it's a very fruitful land, it's a beautiful land, it's everything we could wish for in a land. But it is already inhabited, and these people are not ordinary people. Some of these people are giants. They have cities that have walls built up to heaven, which is no doubt a hyperbole, but They said, and the giants are in there. We look like grasshoppers next to them. That's what they said. And so the people said, this land swallows up its inhabitants. We'll be killed if we go in there. It's like walking off a cliff, being swallowed in a chasm. And so most of the people, unfortunately, listened to those spies who brought the evil report. But there were two spies who didn't bring an evil report. That was Joshua, whom we know from earlier stories. He's of the tribe of Ephraim. He was the representative, the spy from the tribe of Ephraim. And he had been Moses' servant right from the very beginning of the Exodus story. And so we've heard of Joshua several times. And he later becomes Moses' successor as the leader. The other person was Caleb, whom we have not known previously. He was of the tribe of Judah. He was the spy from that tribe. And they were faithful to God. And they said, listen, guys, yeah, there's giants there, but remember who told us that we could have this land? God. God is well able to give us the land. I mean, think of what he did to the Egyptians. Now, we just need to trust God and go in there. It's a land we need to have. Now, the sad thing here is the people listened to the 10 other spies wrongfully and did not, and chose not to go into the land. And God then was angry at the people and said, okay, you guys, you've tested me enough times, but I'm going to let you all die here in the wilderness here. You're not trusting me. You're going to turn back from here and go away from the promised land, wander around the desert for 40 years, or 38 or 39 at this point, and until every one of you who's over 20 years old is dead. And then your children, who are less than 20 years old, they'll be grown up by then. They'll be 60 years old, some of them. And then that's when you'll go in. Of course, at the time they went in, then there was no one among them surviving that was over 60 years old, except Joshua and Caleb. They went in. They were the only two from the older generation that went in because they had given a good report in the face of opposition. Sadly, though, of course, although Joshua and Caleb had the faith to go in immediately, they ended up having to go around wandering the desert for 40 years too with the rest of them. But at least God said, I'm not going to let you two die off out here. I'm going to take you in. But they still had to be inconvenienced for 4 decades. And that's just the way sometimes, sadly, things are. I mean, when a country turns bad, there's often a remnant within it that are good. And the remnant who don't deserve the bad policies that come from the rule of the wicked, majority, well, we just have to live with it. But that doesn't mean that God has the same opinion of everyone living under those conditions. God was angry at Israel as they wandered those 40 years, but he wasn't angry at those two, or at Moses. But eventually Aaron died, Miriam died, and even Moses died before they went into the promised land. Now I will just make one more point, and then I'll take your question, Rose. And that is that once the people heard that God was going to let them wander 40 more years, they said, okay, we changed our mind. Let's go in now. And Moses said, no, you don't. God changed his mind because you didn't obey the first time. Snooze, you lose. You can't go in there now. But the people ignored Moses. They went and they fought against some Canaanites and got beaten pretty badly. And came back to Moses with their tail between their legs. They said, I told you. So from that point on, they had to wander on through the wilderness. And so they did that until the end of the period. Now, actually, when we come to the next chapter, 15, it's 37 years later. Or 36 or 37 or 38 years later. It's the end of that period of time. So we break it here. We'll take our break here. Chapter 14, they were told they're going to have to wander for basically the rest of that generation. When it comes to chapter 15, they have fulfilled that sentence. And now the new generation is gathered, ready to go across and take the land. All right?